Okay, would you give us your name and address, please?
Tim Butz, 2702 Fontenelle Boulevard in Omaha.
Okay, good morning, Tim. Okay, your place of birth is Akron, Ohio. Tell us how you got to Omaha, please.
Well, I went into the service at 17. I enlisted in the Army while my parents were on their honeymoon. They had gotten married during World War II at Luke Air Force Base. And so they didn't have a honeymoon. And for their 20th anniversary, they went to New York to see a Broadway play. And I snuck down to the recruiters, joined the Army. They came home to a day earlier than I thought they would, to a house that was full of empty 3-2 beer bottles and my enlistment papers on the dining room table. And they refused to sign them. They didn't want me going into the Army. There was a compromise where I was able to join my choice, Air Force or Navy, and I couldn't see myself out on the ocean. I'd grown up around airports. My dad flew, so I wanted to have at least that connection with something. So I joined the Air Force at age 17. From there, I went to Vietnam in November of '66. I came home in June of '68. I had spent a 19-month tour in Vietnam. I was asked by the higher-ups to extend my tour for a couple of reasons. One, I was damn good at my job. I was an aircraft crew chief. Secondly, they wanted some people to stay behind. The unit had rotated over together. They wanted people to stay behind as the original folks went home and help with the transition. So they dangled a carrot in front of me that was, when you go home, you'll go to the base of your choice. And so I did it. I felt a duty to do it. When push came to shove, I wanted to go to Lockburn Air Force Base, Ohio, which is about 2 hours from Akron. And the reason I wanted to go there was that my brother had waited till he was 18, joined the Army, and was in flight school, wanting to be a helicopter pilot. And I knew that his first stop after pilot training was going to be Vietnam, and I wanted to be close to my folks in case something happened to him. And you know, whoever was at the assignment desk the day that I came up decided they'd send me to Idaho instead of Ohio, probably because they rhyme. I have no idea. There was a guy getting out of the service at the time I was coming home who'd been in my unit in Vietnam. He had the same skill set that I did, the same level of proficiency, same rank, and I thought I'd be a shoo-in for his position, and I wasn't. So I got very bitter about that, and I left the Air Force after 3 years and 5 months. I took an early out that was offered to me. I returned to Ohio. I went to school at Kent State University. I was there when the National Guard opened fire on students. Someone I knew was one of the 4 students killed, Allison Krause. My oldest daughter is named for her. And I became a very bitter man after that. The idea of Americans shooting Americans just was abhorrent to me. In fact, 2 of the guardsmen that were later indicted had gone to my high school. They were a year ahead of me. So after the shooting, I heard about a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and I joined and was asked to organize a chapter at Kent State, and I spent most of that summer working on that. In October, after school was back up and running, I received a call from Jane Fonda, which I had never met her. In fact, at the time I got the call from her, I had a poster of her on my living room wall, and she was calling from the VVAW national headquarters and asked me to join an organizing effort in Detroit that she was involved with. That was called the Winter Soldier Investigation, and it was VVAW's attempt to show that war crimes were the inexorable result of American policy, American war policy. And there were 6 of us on the steering committee, and we toured the country interviewing vets. We vetted them. We made sure they had paperwork that would back up at least their assignment. And we also wanted verification from another source, someone they'd been with, that could verify their accounts of what happened. And so that happened in January, late January of 71. When that was over, VVAW asked me to go to Washington, D.C. to help organize Operation Dewey Canyon, which was the large and first large veterans demonstration since the Bonus Army. And so I went there, and we pulled that off. One of the best known incidents or occurrences of that demonstration, well, there were 2 that were high in the public register. One was the testimony of John Kerry when he asked the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, how do you ask a man to be the last one to die? And the second, of course, was the returning of medals. So when that was over, I stayed in Washington, helped do local organizing, as well as some other miscellaneous tasks that came across my desk. When the war was over, I left working for VVAW and ended up working in a place called Center for Science in the Public Interest. And, well, actually, there was an intervening thing. An Air Force Security Services friend, veteran, and I were talking about how do we make the country aware of what the government is doing. And we established a magazine called Counter Spy, and it reported on U.S. intelligence operations based on public sources. It didn't have any magic sources inside the CIA or anything. We had no information that hadn't been already in print, but what we were good at is gathering that from especially overseas sources, and then reporting it. And so as we start working on this, there were three of us: Winslow, who is the Air Force Security Services guy, and Bart Osborne, who was a military intelligence operative and ran Phoenix operations in Vietnam. So we set out to do this task of publishing a quarterly journal on intelligence operations. As we're doing this, Norman Mailer had his 50th birthday, and he had a big party and announced that he was going to form something called a fifth estate, someone to watch over Big Brother. And Nat Hentoff, who at that time wrote for the Village Voice, challenged Mailer to meet with us. We had had some conversations with Hentoff, and he challenged Mailer to fund us. So Winslow and I met Mailer in the Watergate bar, and he says, "I hear you want some of my money." And I said, "Yeah, we'd like some of your money." And he said, "Well, you're going to have to fight me for it." And I was still mean and lean back then. And I said, "Okay, let's go outside." And I didn't really want to hit a 50-year-old man, but you know, if that's what it costs to get his respect, I was going to do it. And he backed off from that. He said, that was just a test. And he eventually ended up funding the magazine. So he was involved in a lot of controversies, as you might imagine. And eventually, I felt it had lost its original intent. Its politics had gone too far to the left for my comfort. And so I left, and then I went to work for Center for Science in the Public Interest. And the office manager there was from Omaha, and she returned to Omaha, called me up one day and said, "Hey, there's a great job out here." And I applied for it, and I went through a couple of telephone interviews, because the job did not pay great, but it was an interesting job, and I thought, you know, I can pick up some good skill sets working on this job. And so I was hired without an in-person interview, and moved to Omaha to take the job. And to make a long story short, I ended up marrying my boss. And my original plan when I moved to Omaha was work a couple years, collect these skill sets, and then move to Seattle, Washington, which I just loved. And my wife, Barb, was from the East Bay area of California. She attended UCal Berkeley as an undergraduate. And when we got married, I told her, you know, if you ever want to move back to California, it'd be fine with me. I was going to move to Seattle anyway. And my wife, who has a great sense of humor, got deadly serious and said, I remember the exact words, "I've lived through earthquakes, I've lived through tornadoes, I'll take my chances with tornadoes." And so that was 1979 when we got married, and we're still here. So that's how I got to Omaha from Akron. That's a long story.
but a very interesting one. Let's go back to your military
Mm-hmm.
service. Where were you stationed with the Air Force besides Vietnam?
Well, you know, like every airman, I went through basic training at Lackland Air Force Base, and then I went to aircraft mechanics school at Shepherd Air Force Base. When I graduated from that, I was assigned to Moody Air Force Base in southern Georgia. And while I was there, I got orders for Vietnam. And I had to go to MacDill Air Force Base for 8 weeks, I think it was, of school on different weapon systems. I was working on T-37 and T-38 aircraft in a hangar environment, and I was going to be assigned to a unit that flew the reconnaissance version of the F-4 Phantom. So I went and learned the F-4, and then arrived in Vietnam in late November of 1966. I turned 19 shortly after I got there. And the unit that I was assigned to had rotated from France. The unit was flying EB-66s in France, and the personnel went to Mountain Home Air Force Base and transitioned to F-4s, and then went to Vietnam together, and they arrived in late September of '66, and I was a replacement for some guy that didn't have enough time left on his enlistment to go to Vietnam. So it took a while to get fully staffed. And I was good at my job. I mean, my performance reports were pretty glowing, and I enjoyed my work. I liked being an aircraft mechanic. It's fun. But after, in February of '67, the first sergeant called me in and asked me if I'd be willing to extend my tour, and I agreed to it. And so instead of going home in November of '67, I went home in late June of '68. And the significance of that is that without that extension, I would have gone through Vietnam having been through only one rocket attack. Actually, it was a mortar attack, it wasn't even rockets. But the squadron was based at Tan Son Nhut, which was a large Air Force base and headquarters of MACV, right outside of Saigon. And it became a prime target for the VC and the North Vietnamese to take during the Tet Offensive. They saw that as a key to igniting what they thought would be a popular uprising. Things got nasty at Tet, and after that, I came home to Mountain Home Air Force Base, which I hated, and that was my last. Well, I had one more stop while I was at Mountain Home. I went TDY to Germany when the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, and we flew recon on the German-Czech border for about 3 weeks until we knew that the Russians weren't going to keep heading east or west into Germany. So that was my Air Force career.
Are you still in touch with anybody you served with?
Not recently. My best friend in Vietnam was a guy named Steve Seaman, and a number of years ago, I started having bad feelings that Steve wasn't okay, and so I tried tracking him down, and this was in the early days of the internet, but there were so many Steve Seamans out there that I actually had a form letter on my computer, and when I found a new one, I'd send it to him. And I knew that he was going to go to Chicago when he left Vietnam, so that's where I focused my attention, although I knew from my own history of wanderlust that he could be anywhere. And so one day, a friend of mine who worked in law enforcement, I told the story about trying to find Steve, and he said, "Do you have anything to identify him with?" And I said, "Well, I've got I got a set of our orders. We went on R&R together, and it has a serial number on it, but it's not his social security number, it's his serial number." It says, "Let me have it." And a couple weeks later, he calls me and says, "Try this address." So I sent my form letter off, and came home from work one day to an answering machine message that said, "Tim, this is Steve. Give me a call." And at that time, I was actually the state director for the American Civil Liberties Union and had mentioned that in the message. And so we talked, and I had to go to Chicago for some ACLU business. And so we met up on that trip and it turned out he had been a Chicago cop. He was retired, no longer doing anything dangerous. He was just simply enjoying retirement. And that night we drank an entire bottle of Jameson and hooped and hollered, just like when we were 19 years old. And so I stay in touch with him randomly. My big fear was that something bad had happened to him, and I was pleased that it happened. Nothing happened. And then there's a guy that I was also stationed with in Vietnam, and we connected through Facebook. And I finally had to, I quit going on Facebook. His politics and my politics didn't get along well. And so, it's nice to know that he's okay, he's retired, married, having a good life. So those are the only two I had any contact with after Vietnam.
So you haven't gone to any reunions or unit get-togethers, or have you?
There's a group called the Tansanute Association that opens its membership to anybody that was stationed at the base. and I've gone to a couple of them, and they, you know, they were okay, but nobody I knew ever showed up. I was usually the only one from the 12th TAC Recon Squadron to be there, and so I just quit going.
So you didn't feel connected?
No, I didn't really. Well, there's always a connection, but it wasn't the connection I was looking for. You know, there's a lot of shared experiences, and that creates a certain bond, but you can only tell the same set of stories so many times when it becomes pointless. So, I haven't gone to any. I've never gone to any of the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Reunions. So.
Have you been involved in any veteran organizations?
Well, in 2001, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and the VA doesn't contest claims for type 2 diabetes as a service-connected disease because of Agent Orange exposure. And, you know, I was definitely exposed. After the Tet Offensive broke out, the old man wanted to have by old man I mean the wing commander, wanted a team of people out at the end of the runway at night because our planes were getting shot up taxiing out to takeoff, and they didn't want to lose one on takeoff because a bullet had pierced a fuel cell or something. So I was one of a couple people that had a team, and we rotated doing this last chance check. And that was a pretty hairy operation, because we were out at the end of the runway, right by the base perimeter. And when a plane taxied out, we had to get out of cover and take these large lanterns and visually inspect the plane. So two guys would do that, one on each side, and then I would hook up the intercom and talk to the pilot and make the pilot go through various maneuvers with his flight, his ailerons and so on, looking for signs of hydraulic fluid or other kind of damage. So, you know, we're all standing out there with these huge flashlights, prime target for anybody that wanted to cause us harm. And fortunately nobody, the place we were at is one of the areas where the NVA breached the perimeter and came on the base. And they never tried that route again. They made other attempts on the south side of the base, I believe it was, which is where our barracks were. But you know, it was one of those things when the plane came out, you know, you had really heightened awareness of everything around you. Back in the days before anybody used the term situational awareness, you had to have a high quality of that. And our orders were, if you saw anything dangerous, we were to evacuate and inform the tower so they didn't send any airplanes out. And to back that up, they did issue us M16s, but they only gave us like 5 magazines each. So they did not want us engaging in a huge firefight. And we did book out a couple times when things looked amiss. We didn't book out, we backed up a couple 100 meters. I came out of it unscratched and grateful for it. Anyway, we're getting back to, I lost track of what we were talking about. That area was just constantly sprayed with Agent Orange, especially after the NVA had made their way on base. There wasn't a living, breathing piece of grass out there. And so I filed, with the help of the DAV, Disabled American Veterans, I filed a claim for Agent Orange exposure and got rated for it. And I thought the DAV had done just a great job of representing me, and so I decided I would join. And I've been active in the DAV ever since I joined. Currently I'm a department service officer, which means I help veterans file claims for disability or any other issue that may pop up with their exposure at the VA. But I don't just work out of one place. I actually work out of the Military Veterans Services Center at Bellevue University and the Omaha Vet Center, where I see a lot of vets there too. So there's the operation. I haven't done numbers on the Omaha Vet Center yet, but in 2021, the chapter that's housed at the Bellevue Vet Center took in almost 400 claims from veterans, and I believe it was 31 from widows. And it's all done with volunteer labor. This operation at the Bellevue Center there are 8 accredited service officers here. And, since we reached this unique arrangement with Bellevue University back in 2013 to have a full-time office here, we have seen almost 7,000 veterans. The first year that we opened in December 2013, we saw 5 veterans. Last year we saw over 1,000, and that's working on limited hours because of COVID. And we only have access to the building 3 days a week. So I'm very active in that. I'm a member of BVA, and that's mainly, I'm not active in it. I'm a member, and I did that because I met Bobby Mueller, who founded BVA when we were both members of Vietnam Vets Against the War. And so, it's a good organization. They just don't have the service program that I'm most interested in, which is helping veterans file claims. That's what has kept me out of trouble in retirement. I retired in 2014, and I started working as a service officer the day after I retired. And it's good work. Like this operation here that, collecting stories, I hear some amazing stories. Some of them funny and some of them tragic. But all of them very unique. And, after a while, you know who's lying and who's not. And very rarely do I hear outright lies, but it does happen. We had the occasional guy that comes in and says, I want to file a claim, but the VA won't have any record of me because I was in this super secret unit. Okay. So we have a scammer here, and we show him the door. There is a way, people have been assigned to secret activities, but there are still records of them. And when they tell you there's no record, that's a little sign that maybe they're not telling the truth.
The trigger.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to your family about your Vietnam experience?
A little bit. My wife, my kids know that I was there, but I haven't really shared any war stories with them.
Have they ever asked?
No. I have two daughters, and when the younger one, or the older one, was watching a MASH episode with me, rerun, and it had to do with how Colonel Potter, the MASH unit commander, had been awarded a good conduct medal. But he was an officer. Officers don't get good conduct medals. But the backstory was that he'd been an enlisted man in World War I. So my daughter turned to me and said, Dad, did you get a good conduct medal? And I said, well, I earned one, but I never got it. And she said, I don't think he got one. So, and what had happened when I got discharged, they left it off my DD-214, and when I called the clerk's attention to it, he said, come back tomorrow and we'll have it fixed. I said, I ain't coming back tomorrow. I got a flight out of Boise in 3 hours. So that never got corrected until somewhere in the early 90s when I had to write to the Air Force and ask them for my good conduct medal. And then I showed it to my daughter.
Did either of your daughters, were they interested in serving in the military?
No. No, they weren't. One of them has health problems, would have prevented her from being accepted. And the other had other interests in life, and that's fine.
Yeah.
It did break a string, though. My family has served in the military since the Revolutionary War. Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War. The next generation would have been at the Spanish-American War, and the descendant of the Civil War veteran joined the Ohio National Guard, but was not called to active duty. And then two of my great uncles in World War I, my dad and his cousins all served in World War II. So my brother Tom and I, joining the military wasn't a big deal for us. It was almost like a family obligation.
When you returned from Vietnam, did you sense any reaction from people you met, positive, negative?
Well, back in 1968 when I came home, in order to avail yourself to what was called space available commercial airline traffic, you had to fly in uniform. And it wasn't hard to figure out who'd been to Vietnam because you're 20 years old and have 3 rows of ribbons on your chest. It's pretty apparent where you've been. And I didn't experience any hostility where people called me names or anything like that on my way home. But I was treated, a stewardess came up to me and said, someone on board would like to buy you drinks for this flight. It was a flight from San Francisco to Cleveland, long flight. And I had a pretty wooden leg back then. I drank far too much. So I said, tell them thank you, and I'll have a Jim Beam. And where I ran into hostility was when I started college. And it wasn't hostility, again, in the way of name calling. It was more passive than that. When you're 20 years old and sit in a freshman English class, people know where you've been. And they don't want to have anything to do with you. So, not only and I've read Bob Green's book about whether this hostility was widespread, and he said it wasn't. I think it was. I've just heard too many people tell stories about it, and maybe some of them are lying, but I think there was a little bit of fanaticism that came into play. But to be 20 years old and not be able to get a woman to go on a date with you is hard. And I had to wait for my hair to grow out and become socially acceptable before any of that happened. So, that was the extent of it. Everybody's experience was unique, I'm sure.
Do you think your military experience, how do you think your military experience impacted you as a person or prepared you for life in general? I realize that's a
I learned an awful lot about leadership. And, I supervised 2 people when I was in Vietnam, and even at Mountain Home Air Force Base afterwards, and had to not only direct them but teach them. And the lessons I learned from that, the mistakes I made, taught me a lot of lessons. But I think it prepared me well. And I don't really regret having gone into the service. I wanted to do it. It was my own free will decision. And even though I wasn't very happy with the Air Force at the end, it did teach me a lot. And when you learn leadership skills, if you set your mind to them, you can apply what you learned in the military to civilian activities. I mean, you don't treat a civilian job the way you treat a military job, but there are some principles of leadership that are universal, and extracting those and applying those did well for me. I was director of the state ACLU for 6 years, and to this day, and it was 2000 to 2006, it's now 2021, I still hold the record as the longest serving executive director in Nebraska, which tells you something about the environment here. I mean, death threats, well, how many today,
Do you think Vietnam, the military experience, impacted you more than just the overall military experience?
Well, yes, I do. And what I experienced in Vietnam left me somewhat confused. And, I wasn't really, I didn't come out of the service with a strong anti-war sentiment. It was more like a catch-22 sentiment. But when I got to college and started studying things, then I realized how misinformed that venture was. I'm not going to say lives were wasted, because I don't think that does credit to those that lost their life, to say that their lives were wasted. I lost 2 friends from my youth, and 3, and then 5 that were in my unit. And I could never say that they wasted their lives. They did what was asked of them. The fact that the government lied consistently about Vietnam is not something they knew, nor would it have changed what happened. Vietnam it's a very unique American experience. I think that me going out and reading on my own, and I devour a huge amount of military history. If you look on my phone right now, I've got 3 books on it that have to do with the war in the South Pacific and World War II, because that's my current interest. Vietnam is something I hope we never have to go through again. But I could never say lives were wasted. But I did become anti-war, not because someone preached to me, but because I went out and engaged in actual inquiry, and I learned it on my own, and I trusted that what I learned was the truth because I used reliable sources. I didn't buy the Young Socialist Alliance newspaper and take that as academic research. It's propaganda. But there's enough scholarly works out there that I finally decided, yeah, we really have to put a stop to this thing. And that's why I was glad I found Vietnam Vets Against the War, because those were people that I could relate to and who had a special message about the war.
Have you returned to Vietnam, or do you have any interest in returning to Vietnam?
Actually, I went back to Vietnam in 1970 after the Kent State shootings. The National Student Association, the Southern Christian Leadership, SCLC, yeah, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and a group called Clergy and Laity Against the War in Vietnam put together a delegation to go back to Vietnam and meet with the Third Force, which is not something many people are aware of. But the Third Force was a political movement in South Vietnam that was not communist, but was opposed to the war. And so there was interest in finding out more about these people, and so I went to Vietnam with on that delegation with Bernard Lafayette, who was one of Martin Luther King's associates, Sister Mary Luke Tobin, who was a Catholic nun, Archbishop Paul Moore, who was an Episcopal bishop in New York City, Sam Brown from the Vietnam Moratorium Committee, and I think that was, oh no, there's one more guy, Trudy Rubin's husband. Trudy Rubin, I don't know if you know Trudy Rubin, but she's a reporter, columnist.
Recognize the name.
Anyway, so we went back to Vietnam, and we were having these meetings, and we went out and met the coconut monk, Thich Nhat Hanh. And that meeting had a definite influence on me. I was blown away. I mean, I'd read a little about Gandhi, but Thich Nhat Hanh was just this amazing spiritual man who, was a total pacifist, as in wouldn't kill a fly. After all these meetings at nighttime, we didn't do much, so we were in Saigon. I decided I'd go out to the base and see if our old housemaid was still there, and she was. And she invited me to come to her house for dinner. Now, this woman had lost her husband. He was in the South Vietnamese army and had been killed in battle. So I went to her house and I told her why I was in Vietnam, and she couldn't pronounce my last name, Butz, so she always called me Buck. And she said, Buck, look here. And she took me into her kitchen. She opened a cabinet, pulled everything off the bottom shelf, and there, pasted to the back of the cabinet, was a photo of Ho Chi Minh. And at that moment, I realized there's no way in hell the U.S. is going to win this war. No way. When someone whose husband died fighting the Viet Cong has a photo of Ho Chi Minh in her house, I thought that was pretty amazing.
Wow. Do you have any? Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't talked about or asked you?
Oh,
About
I
your
don't-
military experience, your life related to it afterwards?
you know, I will say one thing about my life afterwards. I would give anything not to have to live with these Agent Orange conditions. Diabetes, neuropathy, now I've come down with tremors. Quality of my life is not what I thought it would be as a 74-year-old man. And it's all because of Agent Orange. So, you know, there are a couple more conditions that the VA is sitting on, and I was at the DAV National Convention this year, and the head of the Veterans Benefit Administration took on the most controversial one, which was hypertension. And I think if you ask Vietnam vets about that, they would say, oh, they're just waiting for us to die. And I think there's a certain element of truth to that. He explained it differently. He said that the VA is grappling with the question of how do you distinguish age-based hypertension from Agent Orange exposure. And, you know, they weren't taking questions from the audience, because I would have asked them, how about a history? I mean, I've had high blood pressure. I'm 74 years old. I've had high blood pressure for over 50 years. And, you know, tell me that wasn't Agent Orange. I had it when I had high blood pressure when I was young and fit. So, anyway, I'd give every dime of VA compensation back to the government if I didn't have to live with these things. And one of them is going to kill me. And I'm at peace with that. Don't like it, but don't have any control over it either. So I guess that's my parting comment.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.